Okay, so I'm going to, hello, Killian.
Hi, hi, hi.
I'm going to start by introducing you. So Killian Doherty is a qualified architect that practices in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Rwanda. Over the past 8 years, through architectural field office interest in notions of conflict, explore the dissonance and unevenness of development policies upon non-Western housing, settlement, and land use practices. Doherty's contributions to this year's biennial are a reflection upon this unevenness through the short film Upland 2018 that screened at the Swamp Pavilion. Made with film director Edward Lawrenson, Upland looks at a western new town built in northern Liberia to explore the environmental and spiritual costs of mining. He also was invited to make a short contribution to the U.S. Pavilion's questions around new forms for citizenship. So we can start.
Okay. So I will do the screen share if it's okay.
Okay. Yes, of course.
Okay, let's try this. Screen. And I will try to. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay. Okay. So thanks very much for inviting me to talk today. It's a privilege, and thank you for being flexible and to reschedule this. And so there were three questions, I suppose, posed to each of the people that invited, and I think you see them here on the screen. It's why does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do, and for whom does the Biennale for whom does the Biennale exist? I think that's correct. Or anyway, so I'm going to sort of try and answer these in relation to my own work, and that is essentially from the position of work in the global South and sub-Saharan Africa. And so what I'm sort of interested in is the sort of obviously the spectacle of the Biennale from the position of its kind of colonial optics, this idea of it being a kind of like stage and to view other places such as work from sub-Saharan Africa and the global South. I suppose there are obvious degrees of control of power and knowledge that I'm interested in, particularly, I suppose, curatorial control around the subject matter and like what kind of drives the kind of subject matter, the particular themes. And I know this year was Free Space by the Irish architects Grafton. But I am also interested in, I suppose, from this post-colonial idea of the center and the periphery, there's a question of the geographic location also being in Venice. And I suppose to kind of situate that concern today about kind of geographic location and accessibility. In 2012, I had, when I was teaching in Rwanda, I had a number of Rwandese students who were fully funded to go visit the Biennale with me, but were denied entry to Italy by Italian immigration for fear of the students being high risk of flight and wanting to stay on in the country. So there's certainly a kind of privilege that comes with the kind of like geographic location of the Biennale in Venice, and it's certainly not accessible to everyone. And I suppose the third thing that I'm concerned about is representation. Again, this idea of the optics, this idea of this colonial optical framing of these other places. And so, I suppose what I'm going to like try and do is set this within the context of my own work. And I suppose in a way, the Biennale is a descendant of this European spectacle and its ability to sort of instrumentalize this kind of colonial optics of these other exotic places. And what I'm particularly concerned about in my current kind of work is the role of the colonial optics of, let's say, seeing and gaining knowledge about other places in the world that are not reachable, and the kind of like misinterpretations of these places and the formation of these spatial imaginaries. And the kind of exhibitions in the kind of history of Europe, or the kind of global North, as I said, it kind of produces these like imaginative geographies, not simply kind of separating our space from someone else's space, but as Edward Said says, you know, the gaze kind of produces imaginative claims to someone else's space that kind of material manifests as physical claims. And for example, let's say Africa has historically been understood through kind of like museums representation, particularly of its nature or of its exotic other. And in 1920, the famous taxidermist and naturalist Carl Ackley was commissioned in 1920 to procure gorillas for the kind of African wing of the American History Museum in New York. And in doing so, Ackley traveled to Rwanda and he killed 5 of the like rare mountain gorillas, skinned them and made like death masks replicating the gorillas and sort of reproducing their likeness for this diorama that exists in New York today. And as kind of a result of this diorama that Ackley had made, he then petitioned to the then sort of European King Albert of the Belgian Congo, who was controlled the land, and he petitioned to King Albert to create the nature reserve for the protection of gorillas. And so that park today is the Virunga Park, which is situated between DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda. And so it's the largest gorilla conservation zone in the world, and it's also a huge source of economic income for the government of Rwanda, DRC, and Uganda. But as a result of like this sort of colonial optics, this like kind of bizarre space has kind of been produced on the edge of these forests. And so say the consequences led to the expulsion of existing forest communities that are remained excluded from the rights of access to the land and the use of its resources for their livelihood needs. And furthermore, the park has kind of produced this sort of re-simulation of nature through this fantasy eco-architecture that sort of replicates a kind of African nature. And in doing so, it has created this like leisure industry, making access even more exclusive and affordable. So in many ways, like sort of the history of the European exhibit has produced this imaginary geography of nature in Africa and of Africa at large, I suppose, where the realities on the ground have real kind of exclusionary consequences. As I said, gorilla tourism in Rwanda is a kind of prime example of what kind of Neil Smith talks about in Uneven Development, sort of where nature is consumed as and environmentally recoded for the purposes of like profit. So the sustainability of nature, is kind of the legacy of this kind of lives out in today's contemporary ideas of sustainability. And it's sort of collectivized into this universal notion of the commons and kind of citizenship, you know. And so we're all expected to engage with nature in a kind of universal but a kind of distant way. And as we know, universals place a kind of universal laws, systems, and codes and expectations on groups of people that kind of have radically different engagements with and perceptions of the natural environment. And so, I mean, this is kind of bringing me roundabout back to the idea of the Biennale as this framing of this other place, and creating this like colonial optical distance, particularly in relation to work on the global south. And also this idea that the work is always brought to the center of the Biennale. I mean, literally, the Kunle Adime's floating school was brought there, and I think Norman Foster reconstructed a pavilion that he was going to build in Rwanda. And so this sort of like logic of the center is reinforced through this idea of the pavilion. that sort of engages with the peripheries through the centralized place of the work. And I suppose like Adima's like floating school and its sort of consequential kind of like demise sort of speak to this idea of the reign of the spectacle and the kind of misunderstanding of the complexity and the specifics of context, but also perhaps raises the questions about the kind of burdens or the social expectations of architecture that we place upon it. So what I'm kind of like currently working in Rwanda is, you know, or sorry, the question is like how relevant is the Biennale to kind of like these particular conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, and how is like kind of the contemporary architecture of Africa kind of produced by the interest of the Biennale, and how does this relate to kind of questions of representation and modes of communication with the periphery? And so, as I said, this is like these questions of post-colonial connotations in terms of kind of dismantling the center. And I'll kind of like show you kind of a few examples of work that I'm kind of doing, and some of the stuff that we've the film that we've presented at the Biennale. And so maybe in a way that these questions are unfair, but there's a certain degree of, let's say, this idea of the kind of colonial optics of the Biennale has a particular effect of thinning out our understanding of these other places, and a particular consequence of thinning out of place, and certainly in these kind of like neoliberal kind of realities of today. And so this kind of thin understanding as well has the effect of kind of depoliticizing really kind of violent spatial, let's say, exclusionary geographies of kind of what's happening in the likes of, let's say, Rwanda. And so I'm particularly kind of concerned by kind of let's say this unevenness of like kind of modernity and development in Africa, and the kind of particular role architecture and these like has of kind of like creating these like fantasies, utopian fantasies about kind of nature, and how they are like kind of disconnected from realities of how actually people utilize and use nature. And this is kind of set within the kind of larger territorial scale of like kind of forest communities across, let's say, the kind of tropics of Africa. And I work in both in Rwanda and Sierra Leone and Liberia. But what I'm particularly kind of looking at currently is the role, let's say, of the industrialization of nature in Africa in relation to how existing hunter-gatherer, let's say, non-capitalist kind of communities currently use and live within nature. And so by contrast, let's say, to this idea of the colonial optics creating a thinning out of our understanding of place, I suppose the opposite, or another way to think is about, from a kind of ethnographic way to think about place in terms of thickness. And I mean, this idea of a thickness of place is borrowing from Clifford Geertz's ethnographic term of, you know, a thick description of place, but also from Polanyi's idea of like substantivism, and that's in terms of like how people engage or live within the kind of social natural world. And so I will quickly just show a kind of clip, it's basically the trailer of the film that we made about Liberia, about this new town that was built in the 1960s by the Swedish, and the industrialist new town was built upon an existing Mano kind of Liberian rural community. And so I'll just briefly jump to a clip of that if I can. Let me just see. Oops. Beg your pardon. There we go. Let's see if this works. So this is just the trailer of the film that we screened at the Swamp Pavilion.
This is all the way up to Abinah Tree. Over there. Down there is the place where the road trap, the train track is passed. Right somewhere down there. But this is all Ikepa. This is all Ikepa zone. This is Omen Ike house. This place, Omen Ike house was there. Because he the chief, he was controlling. This is the place. And this is the place. All over here, this place, their house was there. Around. All over this place. There were single house. The three houses around here. Also, the house that parking about 150 houses were around all over here on the savannah. Yeah, it was a big town. Everybody was there.
So, are you still there? Yeah. Let me just go back to where I was. And so the film about Ikepa, about this northern, this small town in northern Liberia that was like transformed by the Swedish. It's not simply a kind of like a story about the past, because the town is currently the town was reopened, or the mine was reopened in 2010 by ArcelorMittal, following, let's say, kind of renewed interests in the kind of cheap Liberian ore, primarily driven by kind of Chinese supply. But as I say, these aren't like necessarily, the film isn't necessarily a story about the past. It's like currently, it's current today. And ArcelorMittal, let's say, are the largest producers of structural steel, and let's say this building on the left is a building that is currently under construction in New York. It's one of the largest additions to the New York skyline. And so my point is that the kind of idea of the work doesn't just simply rely on this idea of a kind of romanticized idea of a kind of local narrative, but it's a rather kind of dual reading of how not only is there a kind of thinning out of place within, like, let's say, an African context such as Liberia, but there's just a kind of correspondence kind of globally, where there's a production of like these new buildings kind of out of resources drawn from elsewhere. And so, as I say, I'm kind of concerned about the kind of like the thickness of these contexts, particularly through this idea of social space. And we have to understand that there's not the context in Africa is not necessarily the same as our kind of late capitalist neoliberal society that we have in Europe. Nature and society are much more proximate. People kind of, or let's say, nature and society is informed by non-capitalist relations with nature, egalitarian practices, like such as by hunter-gatherer communities. Many of these communities are self-managed, as I say, and so so this film is like kind of one way of trying to perhaps challenge this like idea of this kind of colonial optics and this kind of thinning out of place. And then thickness is also kind of done through practices on the ground, maybe much more closer to kind of how we understand architectural practice. And it's through kind of social exchanges that kind of promote ideas around adult literacy. That is to say that, let's say, where development, the idea of development is claims to help communities, it can often have the effect of undermining them and making them kind of dependent upon outside aid. And so a lot of the work that I do, let's say, works around ideas of adult literacy in relation to kind of co-making and mapping and drawing. And then kind of like thickness, kind of the idea of thickness, I hope, permeates into kind of like actual design proposals, and these are generated with these communities. And it's not necessarily always architectural. I mean, for a lot of the work that I'm doing with the hunter-gatherer communities is much more about like what is relevant in terms of an intervention, and then often it's to do with what type of vegetation or what type of tree is of use to them. And so design in this instance is like, in the work that I do, often is, let's say it's spatial, of course, but there's very little kind of actual physical architecture that manifests within it. So if we could sort of just return to this question about the Biennale and this idea, I suppose what I'm concerned is like, how does Biennale, I suppose, challenge the sort of optics of colonialism? And as we know, kind of colonialism is not a monolithic thing, but it kind of continually evolves. And the reason that I'm showing you this picture is, I mean, this is the Irish land evictions of the kind of late 19th century. And I suppose there's always the understanding that colonialism is something that's produced in the global south, but it's continually evolving and has different kind of manifestations. And so there could be an argument to say that the Biennale does mobilize this misunderstanding of these other places and sort of fetishizes these this kind of social architecture of Africa. So so maybe we could kind of like discuss, I don't know, that idea of the Biennale is how does it challenge the optics of colonialism? And maybe it's a question of subject matter, you know, like what subject matter is presented at the Biennale. And I found that the US Pavilion was quite pointed in its questions in terms of challenging what was happening in the US in terms of, or its question was pointed towards citizenship. And again, these questions don't necessarily affect minorities from the global south or refugees, but they affect everyone. I mean, particularly in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, the whole question of Brexit, and I'm currently in the USA and I can't travel to the Biennale because of the limits on my mobility, because of the rules of the green card. Yeah, there's a number of like questions about the Biennale's role and kind of sort of reproducing or reproduced as this colonial space. So maybe that's something we could discuss. I don't know. I think hello? Hello? Hello?
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask something regarding the issue that you're talking about. So you're saying that, as far as I understand, you're recognizing this colonialism in a way, and the way these biennials started working in a European context.
Mm-hmm.
So you also you were Upland was viewed in the U.S. Pavilion, right?
Yeah, that's no, sorry, viewed in the Lithuanian Pavilion.
In the Swamp Pavilion. Sorry.
Yeah.
But as you say, the U.S. Pavilion also had this the issue of citizenship. But do you think that this is kind of you said that in this neoliberal kind of a space in the biennial, it kind of changed and somehow the representation that we have in the biennials. But also, I feel that maybe there's this contradiction of, for example, some of these pavilions are national pavilions, and the U.S. Pavilion is actually speaking about citizenship as a, maybe, let's say, as a criticism, but it is a national pavilion of the U.S. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, sure.
I want to ask you that is this somehow a contradiction that we don't deal with, or should we altogether maybe, you know, stop? I don't know, like, should it be a form of protesting, of not being in the pavilions at all? For example, let's say maybe you, or I don't know. Did you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are many things at play. I mean, and this is something that I thought of myself. I mean, if the Biennale disengaged from the whole of Venice, yeah, let's say, would it be welcomed? Because there's always the complaint that there's too many tourists in Venice, yeah? Or, you know, does the whole sort of like political economy of Venice depend upon, you know, the existence of the Biennale? You know, so I mean, there's like, there's a question about, yeah, sort of the political economy of the Biennale and its relation to Venice, first of all. And then there's the second question about artistic, let's say, license and, or let's say, like a form of demonstration, as you said, to protest. And I mean, I suppose that's one of the kind of main criticisms, maybe in more recent years, is sort of the soft or light political touch by, let's say, the Biennale each year. You know, it tends to be more of the criticism that it's not political enough seems to be kind of gaining momentum. Would you agree? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I know that Chipperfield's, sorry, the previous Biennale, I think there was the expectations that it would be heavily political, but maybe it fell short of expectations. And then this year, there was a similar claim. I think it's something that it's always going to be, the contradiction is kind of built into it, and built into the existence of the Biennale and its center in Venice. And I honestly don't know how that can kind of be dismantled, but I do think that the point that you made about the USA being it was commissioned by the USA and it sort of turned the criticism back on itself was extremely constructive, you know. So yeah, I mean, certainly I think that is perhaps that should be the kind of role of the Biennale. I mean, in some respects, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in the fact that what the Turkish pavilion is doing is sort of like opening up the doors beyond Venice. And I mean, was that? I mean, I don't know enough about that, but is that like a political statement in itself against the Biennale, or, you know, not against it, but a commentary on it, its limits?
Well, not exactly. I don't think it's a political comment or anything, but well, it's kind of not specifically political, let's say.
Yeah.
But the US pavilion, as an example, I said that because of the citizenship title that it had somehow. But like the Turkish pavilion doesn't actually state that kind of a statement. So
I think the Scottish had an interesting response in 2012. And I think what they did was that they had like a theatrical open air dinner in the Costello neighborhood where they invited like the local residents, artists, architects, and sex workers and activists to they had a dinner and they ate and drank and discussed these questions, you know, and I thought that was really, even though it's sort of still, of course, a spectacle, but it was sort of, it seemed much more relevant in terms of what was happening in Venice. But then there's a question of how is it relevant to people in Rwanda or in Liberia? And I honestly don't think it is at all, you know. So.
Okay, so I think we have another question.
my question can be an ignorant one, probably, but I'm really, I was a little bit far from the topic since your presentation. So thanks for opening a new door. My question is about working in the post-conflict environment in Rwanda. How, I mean, these conflicts are kind of international. I know we all go through these things, and but in this specific case, how does your position there as an outsider in exclamation marks affect the projects there, and how does it affect your input in the project as well? How do you work there together with the locals? Could you tell us a little bit more about the process there?
Well, I suppose the role of the outsider, I mean, often, if not always, the work is funded or it's as a result of like international finance or an NGO that is financed from the outside, you know. And so it's always in response to, let's say, demands and the expectations of an international organization, you know. And so you're always dealing with that internal kind of conflict with the work itself that it manifests from people from the outside saying what is needed internally. So there's always that sort of like difficulty with the work, and it's within the kind of day to day of how architecture is made. It's very difficult to kind of overcome that, you know. And in terms of like working with the locals, again, it depends from project to project. Some, let's say, some organizations just have it fast tracked. They want to they hand you a budget and a timetable, and that's what they want to. It's sort of like object oriented, and they want something quickly produced. And then I suppose if participation is included, or that they want you to engage with the community, it can often be like tokenistic, you know. And so a lot of these kind of concerns kind of correspond with let's say the way like prior knowledge is kind of produced in these kind of colonial in Africa. And so the minute that you begin to want to challenge these think about these kind of questions, it becomes very hard to practice as an architect and get paid. And so that's kind of why a lot of my work is kind of research based now. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Honestly, it will be a direct question maybe, but to me, when I just want to speculate on the issue to discuss a little bit. Like when I look at it in the biennial, for example, it reminds me of you know, you're from not you, maybe another architect. Let's bring that a little bit far away from our talk now. But someone from a developed country goes to Africa and works on decolonization of architecture. There should be really. It's a tense topic, I guess. How do you? And I am really convinced by your sincerity there too. So, but for me, it's a bit difficult to understand where does this decolonization or colonization in worse examples stand. I couldn't make myself clear, maybe, but it sound like, you know, America bringing peace to Iraq, for example. It's a strong topic. It's something else. The context is totally different. I know, but I don't know. how can I ask?
No, yeah, I understand what you mean in terms of.
Thank you.
Well, I think I understand, but I suppose one nature of, or the kind of history of colonialism, or a kind of, let's say, a way of understanding it, or that interests me, is like the idea that colonialism is not kind of monolithic. It doesn't necessarily belong to, let's say, what has happened in Africa or what has happened in Asia, but it's also happened in Europe. And I mean, for me, particularly being from Northern Ireland, that sort of, and Northern Ireland is post-conflict. There are parallels to be drawn between the work, or where I'm from, and the kind of the reasons that kind of brought me to Rwanda. But the original reasons and vehicles that brought me to Rwanda were what you spoke of. It was aid. It was a sort of humanitarian, philanthropic, let's say, mode of practice, about wanting to let's say, make a contribution. But it's kind of upon being there that I realized that it was much more that is enmeshed in these sort of like colonial histories. Okay, and certainly there's a difficulty being a white man being there, and I mean, I don't tend to use the term decolonialization that much. I mean, it's not it's not something that, because it's become sort of overburdened, and the notion of me being there claiming that I'm trying to do that. But I do think that in the current guise of architecture, and a lot of the architecture that is produced about Africa and the global South has got those shadows of colonialism, and I do think it kind of it sort of needs to be challenged in that way. So yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. It was very clear, I think.
And I mean, one thing that's particular about the film is the film we haven't shown in Liberia yet. And me and Edward, the filmmaker, it's problematic that we haven't been back there, and that's one of the first things we wanted to do. We didn't want to screen it in Europe before we screened it in Liberia, but we have, because I suppose we didn't have an opportunity yet to go back. But this, you know what I mean? So there's a kind of contradiction about the film in itself, that it hasn't been screened in Liberia. Europeans have seen it before Liberians have.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very inspirational. So we're so happy to welcome you here, and I think we need to go now.
All right. Thanks very much.
We thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.